Culture Quarter, I'm Siobhan Heanue. Coming up, a stirring tale about love, loss, war and Facebook.
It's obviously very tender. He had very warm feelings towards her and he put them in the music. Honourable people lived at that time and they did brave things and courageous things and they loved very deeply and everything about it is very attractive.
But first up, an Australian philosopher is the subject of the latest portrait commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery. His face will soon adorn the walls alongside Australians ranging from sports stars to statesmen. The new work was unveiled as part of a daring and confronting show exploring the links between art and psychology. It's called Inner Worlds.
Well, consciousness, subjective experience, is by its very nature is indescribable and ineffable. It's just pictures and images and fleeting thoughts and feelings. In the science of consciousness and the philosophy of consciousness, we're constantly searching around for methods to represent states of consciousness so we can analyse them, so we can talk about them.
In the colourful world of philosophy, it's a question of trying to capture what can't always be put into words. The gallery's latest portrait depicts world-renowned philosopher David Chalmers. Director of the Centre for Consciousness at the Australian National University, he's also a visiting professor of philosophy at New York University.
I'm fascinated by consciousness, the nature of subjective experience, what's going on inside someone's inner experience from the subjective point of view. So it's not so much what you see from the outside.
Portrait making is also about trying to look within.
Gallery curator Chris Chapman says there's a strong connection between psychology and portraiture. In the gallery's latest commission, the artist has intentionally blurred the lines, so to speak, between the two.
I'm not interested in creating that sense of the subject pinned down in a moment.
What Melbourne artist Nick Moutsakis is interested in is conveying the subject's interior world, not just his physicality, but the way he thinks.
His thinking is, his thinking is at a highly evolved, highly developed level, highly discreet level.
The artist has stripped away the philosopher's trademark hair, instead trying to explore the tangled layers of his mind.
Interesting and disconcerting, I would say.
Nick Moutsakis sat with David Chalmers to make initial sketches. The final portrait was reworked many times.
I might have formed some impression, strong impression of David. It was so complex that I couldn't encompass it in those initial studies that I made.
So he went back to his studio, composing and finessing a series of abstract lines that reflect the philosopher's rather abstract presence. And despite all the angular action, the finished work is strangely calming to ponder. The work is the centrepiece of an exhibition tackling the darker side of human experience. The show tracks the history of psychology in Australia, appropriately starting in wartime. Medical doctors who worked with soldiers in World War II felt that they weren't being treated for their internal war wounds. Soldier artists like Albert Tucker furthered their cause by sketching the trauma triggered by warfare. This work, depicting breakfast in the army barracks, portrays the fear and the despondency that was the experience of many soldiers. Tucker was also employed by military doctors to document through images the various forms of psychological trauma exhibited by soldiers who were coming back from the front.
And he made a series of portraits that are very, very powerful that then fed into the symbolism of his subsequent work.
They're themes that have intrigued Australian artists down the decades. In the 80s, artist Dale Frank gave a modern interpretation of what it must have been like to be a World War I soldier affected by poison gas.
It's a very psychedelic, hallucinogenic, imaginative work, but he's trying to capture that sense of anxiety, the quivering fear, exhilaration, uncertainty that he imagines a soldier, himself as a soldier, might have experienced.
The galleries also managed to get hold of a fascinating display of patient drawings from the 1960s, examples of how art can be used to explain where words may fail.
Using their creativity and their free expression allowed that communication.
Perhaps art can answer what lies behind what makes us who we are.
Art just has so many extra resources through the imagistic, the way it taps deeply into the emotional.
Nothing can be taken for granted. Absolutely nothing can be taken for granted. One can't really presume to know.
And now to a story of love and war, music and Facebook. A Canberra musician has tracked down a long-lost violin sonata that was composed in the trenches at Gallipoli by an Australian soldier. Frederick Septimus Kelly wrote it for the girl he admired, but it was lost for 80 years. Kate Evans reports. In the trenches of Gallipoli, a soldier composed a violin sonata for the woman who loved him. That soldier was Sydney-born Frederick Septimus Kelly, one of Australia's true Renaissance men. He won a gold medal for rowing at the 1908 Olympics, then became a pianist and composer in pre-war London. In 1909, aged 29, he was introduced to the 16-year-old Hungarian violinist Jeli Dranyi. She had just arrived in London with her sister Adela, also a violinist.
And in the first sort of meeting, Jeli's hardly noticed. She's like the younger sister who plays quite well, he notices. And as he keeps playing with them, he becomes less and less interested in Adela and more interested in Jeli's playing, who he realises is the more talented of the two and the more spirited violinist. He seems to have this idea that she's his little sister or something, so there's a very warm feeling towards her, but she's totally smitten with him.
When war broke out in 1914, Kelly signed up, not with the Australian forces but with the Royal Naval Division in London, and was sent to Gallipoli. During gaps in the fighting, he composed a violin sonata for Jeli Dranyi, finishing the work just before the evacuation in January 1916.
There is something about it, it's obviously very tender. He had very warm feelings towards her and he put them in the music. And the other thing that's interesting is that he didn't want to be in the trenches, so it's got nothing to do with the trenches. He says to her, don't expect to hear rifle fire or artillery in it. It's nothing like that. It's a way of him coping. He went to England in his mind, and it's a green field, and it's sunny and beautiful, and everything about it is just what he would want to have been doing, but instead he's in a trench.
Frederick Kelly spent his leave in London playing the sonata with Dranyi, but was then posted to France. During the Somme campaign, he was sent to the front lines and was killed attacking a machine gun nest on the last day of the battle, his final composition left unfinished. Jeli Dranyi played the violin sonata at his memorial service.
There's a reference in her letters where she talks about 10 days after his death that she wakes up about 2 in the morning and she can hear the first melody of this violin sonata being played, but as if by a very bad violinist or a beginner, and sounding as if it's coming over a large body of water. And she always thought that was how he said goodbye to her.
Dranyi went on to become a famous violinist and a muse for composers Elgar and Bartók.
No, she never marries and keeps his picture on her piano for the rest of her life.
The sonata wasn't played for another 80 years and disappeared from the record until Canberra musician Chris Latham read Kelly's diaries.
And they referred to a violin sonata in a key that wasn't in the National Library's archive. So I knew there was something missing and I couldn't figure out where to go next. And then I thought, if I was a violinist and I had played it and I was in love with him, I would have hung on to the music. I realised that the violin had gone to the niece, and then I found the niece's maiden name, and then the niece had a daughter, and I found her maiden name, and then I found that daughter. And it was just a sort of a detective game, really. But in the end, I contacted her through Facebook. She emailed back saying, yes, I have her music, and we were wondering what to do with it. And so then I asked, you wouldn't have seen a piece by Kelly in there, would you? And she said, yes, I think I did see that. And then there was an agonising year until I got there to see.
The sonata was there in Florence among D'Aragni's papers, and Chris Latham brought a copy of the manuscript home. He's now preparing to perform it at the Canberra International Music Festival.
I was very fond of my grandmother, and she was a nurse in the First World War, and I didn't actually piece it together until the end. She actually served in the hospital right next to where he was killed, and I like to think that she might have been able to see him and tell him that her grandson would take care of him. But yeah, for some reason it's very personal for me. I don't know quite how to explain it. It's rich and it's beautiful, and honourable people lived at that time, and they did brave things and courageous things, and they loved very deeply, and everything about it is very attractive. Wonderful people sacrificed enormous things, and he was part of that, and it's hard not to be inspired.
Well, that's almost it for this episode. But just before we go, most Australian cities and towns have some sort of public art, the kind of sculptures that are occasionally controversial but usually warmly embraced. Now, the ACT's Chief Minister John Stanhope recently retired after 10 years in the top job. And among other things, he'll be remembered for his determination to bring art to the suburban streets of the capital. Here's a look at some of it. I'm Siobhan Henu, and I'll catch you next time on The Culture Quarter.